Well, so we're welcoming RamDev Dale Borglum, founder, executive director of Living Dying Project. To know Dale is a real privilege for me. He's a friend, someone I admire a tremendous amount, has taught me very, very much, and been a tremendous resource. He's also been a pioneer with many others, thousands of others, and really was a crucial part of the conscious dying movement as it came to fruition with folks like Ram Dass, Stephen Levine, with whom he's worked. He continues his work with folks, life-threatening illnesses, their families, over 3 decades of committed service Dale has given us. Many, I think, know either of Dale's books or of his teachings, or of the fact that he was instrumental in putting together the first residential facility, at least in the US. I think it's called the Dying Center, for people that wanted to die consciously. There's so many different things afoot right now in our world. And so these qualities of body, mind, heart that could hopefully enable us to find ways of getting through life when it's challenging. This is what Dale will speak to us on here, and will give us some insight into practices that we may take up that will help awaken our ability to transform and transcend and carry on. Sure do love you, Dale. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Nate. Thank you for the kind introduction. I am the director of the Living Dying Project. It was really started a long time ago by first Stephen, and then Stephen Levine, and then Ram Dass and I joined him. And that was sort of the beginning of the conscious dying movement. So why don't, before I tell you how to do all this, why don't we just have a very brief history of how all this began? And Ram Dass knew Aldous Huxley, and Aldous wrote a book called Island, in which he talked about a utopian community in which people died consciously. Ram Dass thought this was a great idea. He went around talking about it back in the 1960s, and the society is not ready to hear about it yet. It just went through deaf ears, if you will. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross showed up, and she brought dying out of the closet. She was not talking about conscious dying. She was talking about dying itself, and that was the transition stage, if you will. Ram Dass actually said that Elizabeth Ross was an attached saint, that she was very saintly, but she was really not doing the spiritual thing so much, but she did something incredibly important. And then at one point, Ram Dass taught a workshop on the East Coast in Rhode Island, actually, at which Elizabeth came as a student, and at which Stephen Levine, Ram Dass's old buddy, was the Buddhist meditation teacher. And Elizabeth and Stephen really hit it off. She invited him to be the Buddhist meditation teacher at her retreats. They did that for a while. She got involved in some violent psychodrama that didn't dovetail too well with Buddhist meditation. So they parted amicably, and Stephen started teaching on his own and inviting me to be the Buddhist meditation teacher at his workshops. And it's, of course, impossible to just be the Buddhist meditation teacher when you're around a room full of people who are dying and grieving and caregiving and say, well, I'm the Buddhist meditation teacher. One gets very emotionally, intimately involved with people's lives and emotions. So that happened back in the early 70s. Nate said I've been doing this for 30 years. It's been actually 45 years. I just turned 80 a couple of months ago, believe it or not. And the Living Dying Project is exploding. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, we're doubling the number of clients and volunteers. We quadrupled the size of the board. We have the most complete website on the internet about conscious dying, a lot of free information. I have a Saturday, every other Saturday group that has 330 people in it. And I've got a podcast. So all the stuff is mentioned on the website, livingdying.org. So getting back then to what we're really doing here in terms of offering spiritual support. What does it mean to be offering spiritual support to people who have life-threatening illnesses, people who are grieving, people who are caregiving? And I would like to encourage this not to be Dale giving a lecture. At any point, just jump in and make a comment or ask a question. Let's be as collaborative here as we can possibly be. So back in the day when I was really a yogi, back in the 60s and 70s, and all these lamas and swamis and roshis and people were coming through San Francisco, I had a test question where somebody would come up on the stage and I'd say, I got a question. And the question was, I've got a friend who's dying and she's never meditated and she's afraid. What's the best thing I can do for her? And the answer I got from most of the people was something like this: merge your mind with the one mind, and then merge your mind with the mind of your friend. So usually when people come to the Living Dying Project or they're thinking about the Living Dying Project, it's what help can I get? What practices can I do, body, mind, and spirit, to awaken, to become a deeper person? But the problem is, as long as I think I'm a caregiver and you're a dying person, or I'm a caregiver and you're a grieving person, there's that separation, and there's something in you that needs to be fixed, then healing can happen, but not the deepest healing. Let me read a poem from Hafiz that I've really been loving lately. Now is the time to know that all you do is sacred. Now, why not consider a lasting truce with yourself and God? Now is the time to understand that all your ideas of right and wrong were just a child's training wheels to be laid aside. When you finally live with truthfulness and love, now is the time for the world to know that every thought and action is sacred, that this is the time for you to compute the impossibility that there is anything but grace. Now is the season to know that everything you do is sacred. So, is dying as sacred as not dying? Is grieving as sacred as not grieving? And it's so easy to feel, I have all these years of experience, I'm the director of the Living Dying Project, I have a PhD and whatever, and I'm here to help you. But to the extent that I'm doing that, I can offer some good advice. You can feel a sense of support and connectedness. But the deepest healing that we are living in wholeness, we are living in oneness, is not going to be happening. So can we, instead of treating the brokenness, instead of treating the illness, instead of treating even the person, we're treating the illusion that there's separateness, that we're going right to the place of wholeness. Now, that's really an ideal. I get it. I can't do that all the time. You can't do that all the time. So, as was advertised, I'm going to talk about the ways to build up to be able to do that, right? But the goal is, as far as I'm concerned here, is me being able to rest in wholeness, because that's where we're going to die into. And we can talk a lot about practices and working with suffering and getting better at being healers and providers and whatever we're doing. But really, when you die, when I die, we're going to be dissolving into this wholeness that the Tibetans say, you see a light that is as bright as 1,000 suns. That's a pretty darn bright light. So can you imagine loving the person you love the most as bright as 1,000 suns? And maybe you felt that for a moment. Probably you have. Have you looked in the mirror and felt that? Have you been able to sustain that wattage of love, of bearing the light over the course of an afternoon? Probably not. So that you're really loving somebody, and then all of a sudden you're thinking about what's for lunch. Because being in that 1,000 suns is ego death. It's dying before you die. So that there are these two spiritual paths that are kind of parallel, if you will. One of them is we're working with the obstacles. We're working with the stuff that's locked in the body keeps the score, all the stuff we've shoved down into the belly. We're working with that stuff. through compassion, through embodiment, etc. But the other path is moment to moment, day to day, learning to bear this unbearable light. As Hafiz is saying here, we throw away the training wheels, the child's training wheels of their things that are right and wrong, that it's all sacred. There's these wonderful books by Father Greg Boyle from Homeboy Industries in LA. And he's working with gang members and ex-cons who come to him and say, Father Greg, make me a better man. I want to be a better man. And he says, I can't make you a better man. You're perfect the way you are. God loves you exactly the way you are. Your job is to accept that perfection. Let me read one other short quote here, this time from Rumi, and I've really been playing with this one for a long time. In response to one who said his prayers were never answered, that he never heard anything back from God. And then here's what God says in the poem. The longing you express is the return message. The grief you cry out from draws you toward union. Your pure sadness that wants help is the secret cup. Okay, so instead of we're praying to get something that's not here, we realize that the longing itself, the hole in our heart itself, is the return message. That accepting the humanity of being broken is sacred, is divine. And once again, such a beautiful idea. How do we really get there? Okay, so I put together a healing paradigm. My podcasts go into this deeply. The Saturday group, we've been talking about this since right as the pandemic began. 100 Saturdays probably by now, I guess. And there is a path. There is a path that the world's religions have talked about. They talk about it differently. It's also talked about in terms of stages of early childhood development, somatic theory. They're all really saying the same thing. And as a recovering mathematician, which almost killed me, but it allows me to see patterns of things. So I've taken the psychology, the somatic, the spiritual, the 12 steps, all these different things, and kind of summarized or essentialized. And here's what I've gotten that really works for me and for a lot of people that I work with. The first thing is we've got to be motivated. In Buddhism, there's this motivating statement that you contemplate, you're going to die, but you don't know when. Nothing could be more intellectually obvious, but do we really know that in our bones? When right now, do we really know that we might not survive to the end of me talking for the next 45 minutes or whatever it's going to be? We don't know that. If we really knew that we might die, how intimately, how lovingly, how intensely would we be here in this moment? The fact that we're going to die and we don't know when is really good news. It's not frightening news. It's a motivating truth that brings us into the moment. So Suzuki Roshi said, the most important thing is finding the most important thing. What is the most important thing? Do you want to wake up, or do you want to have more money, or do you want to have a comfortable life, or do you want to help people? But what is the most important thing for you? And once you really identify that, then that can motivate us diving into this path that is going to be challenging. It's guaranteed that it's going to be difficult. In fact, if you haven't started the path already, get out of the Zoom, leave the room, and never start, because it's going to be much more work than you ever thought it was going to be, which is a sales pitch, because I know then that nobody would ever leave, of course, right? Okay. So the first stage of practice is trusting that we can be here with what it is that's going on. In Buddhism, they talk about vipassana, mindfulness meditation. You're trusting that all you have to do is be mindful of what's happening in your life, which might be cancer, which might be a friend of yours is dying, which might be you hate Republicans. I mean, who knows what it is? But there's things going on that are beautiful. There's the the light of 1,000 suns is shining from you and in you, and there's all these other things going on. Can we be present for that? And can we let go of the narratives that keep us from being present? So for example, in English, when we're afraid, we say, I am afraid. In Spanish, yo tengo miedo, I have fear. In Tibetan, fear is here. So just the way we think about things here, or language it in English, it's so hard not to get caught in identifying with the emotion. Usually when people are feeling difficult emotions, they get lost in the trigger. I'm afraid of that. I'm angry at her. Instead of what does it feel like in me? So this first step, at least in terms of the mind, in terms of mindfulness, is letting go of the narrative, letting go of the story, and being with what it feels like. What does it feel like in your heart, in your belly, around your eyes, to be frightened, to be grieving? I talk a lot about conscious grief, that instead of being lost in the story of the grief, just occasionally at least, can we feel the grief? Can we be awake in the horrible blessing of grief? Okay, from the standpoint of the body, what does it mean to be able to trust being present? And from the Piaget, and people talk about stages of childhood development, it's being grounded and centered. So a lot of all this Buddhist, Hindu, Sufi, all this great wisdom from the East was written by and for people long ago who were grounded and centered, who were walking around barefoot, who slept in the same bed with their parents more than likely, who didn't have an iPhone for sure. They had a very different life, a very different set of problems than you and I have. And that so many people I know have deep spiritual yearning and they're not in their body at all. So that they work with dissolving, they work with being more loving, and they can sustain that for a minute or 15 minutes if they're chanting with Krishnadas or whatever it might be. And then something comes along and the environment is not 100% supportive, and boom, the love is all gone. So that we have to learn to drop down into to create a foundation, being embodied, the root chakra, which is about fear and anxiety, the second chakra, guilt, third chakra, shame. All this stuff is before we're even having relationship. It's about being in a body, having a body that moves, and beginning to create ego identity. Then after you've really worked with some of that stuff, then love becomes a real possibility in some ongoing way, rather than this thing that we kind of force to happen through practices, and then you get on the computer or you get in your car and there's a traffic jam and you're screaming at people. Okay, so and from the standpoint of the heart, it's realizing that the brokenness of the heart is the return message, just like Rumi said, that in the beginning, to feel that we're not connected, to feel that we don't feel the spaciousness of heart, that is the message, that's the perfect healing message of the moment, right? That it's like, it's so easy to begin spiritual practice from the standpoint of, this is this big self-improvement project, because who I am right now isn't good enough. And if I meditate enough, and I say enough prayers or mantras, then I'll get to be this better person that I read about in books. And I see all these spiritual teachers up there claiming that they are. And I know a lot of these spiritual teachers, and they're not. Every one of these people is just as human as you and I are. Mother Teresa was not Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa was a very complicated woman, right? She helped a lot of people. She raised a lot of money in kind of nefarious ways. Great, she helped a lot of people. But to start comparing ourselves to RamDev or Mother Teresa or something, I mean, even beyond that, Stephen Levine wrote all these books about people dying that has made my life a lot harder, because almost nobody dies a Stephen Levine death, right? It's like people are supposed to die the way Stephen talks about. That rarely happens. And Stephen Levine had a lot of non-Stephen Levine deaths himself, I might add. Okay, so certainly that doesn't prevent us from being more engaged in offering support and help and love. So suppose then you or I work with getting grounded, getting centered. This stuff is talked about on my website. If you want to go into more detail, we obviously don't have time today. You're becoming more mindful of how you're living your life, how you're pulling back from living your life, how alive do you really want to be. And as then the mind begins to stabilize, then the heart begins to open in a very natural way, because you're not trying to get away from suffering all the time. You're not bobbing and weaving. You're allowing life to come to you. You're meeting it intimately and fully and directly. And the heart begins to open. And the open heart has three defining qualities. One of them is connectedness. Are you connected to yourself? Are you connected horizontally to the people around you? Are you connected vertically to whatever you think is the verticality? You guys are having too much fun there, Nate and Sandra. Come on now, pay attention. Okay.
We're loving every word of this.
That's my
Okay.
goal.
Okay, so can you be connected? And as I said before, maybe I didn't say, but yeah, I did. Fear is the enemy of the first chakra. Guilt, what you're doing, is the enemy of the second chakra. Shame, shame of who you are, is the enemy of the third chakra. What do you think is the enemy, the demon of trying to open your heart, having an open heart? What emotion makes it hard to open the heart? Fear, guilt, shame. Now you're trying to have conscious relationship. Nobody remembers from year to when I come back here. That's okay.
Anger?
So the answer is grief.
Oh,
Grief, we're all grieving. We've all lost a lot. And we unconsciously begin to feel, I open my heart up, what happens? He leaves, he disappoints, he dies, God isn't there, whatever it might be. Rumi has this wonderful quote, grief is the garden of compassion. Grief is the garden of compassion. What is he trying to say here? Grief are the negative emotions that arise when we're feeling separate. I shouldn't say negative, the difficult emotions that arise when we're feeling separate. Sadness, anger, frustration, fear, confusion, all grief reactions, right? Somebody cuts you off in traffic, you get angry. That's a grief reaction because you're not feeling connected to yourself. You're not feeling connected to the doofus in the other car there who's driving like a maniac. Okay, somebody else could be cut off. They felt connected. They didn't grieve. They said, oh, somebody's having a bad day. Okay, so what Rumi is saying here is, can we begin to transmute these feelings of grief and separation into feelings of connectedness and compassion? And then then the grief is a garden from which compassion grows. Compassion is the open heart meeting suffering. Stephen Levine poetically called compassion keeping your heart open in hell. Compassion is exactly the same thing as loving kindness, but in the context of suffering, the open heart meeting suffering. And in my experience personally and as a teacher, that compassion, and particularly self-compassion, which is rarely talked about in Eastern traditions because they assume you love yourself if you're going to start doing all these practices, that self-compassion and compassion in general is the keystone, the center point really of the spiritual path. I was at a Tibetan empowerment once. It was an all-day program. There was a Tibetan Lama there, and he said, okay, we need to open our hearts. So everybody think about your mother. And he said, oh, wait a minute, this is America. If you think about your mother in America, it doesn't mean your heart's going to open. And everybody kind of laughed a little bit, but it's the saddest thing you could imagine, isn't it? What could be more sad? He comes from a place where you think about your mother, your heart springs open. The Dalai Lama in his third visit to America said, now I'm beginning to understand you Americans don't like yourselves. So if we're trying to embark on this big journey of disidentifying with ego structure and identifying with true nature, from the initial stance of not liking ourselves, one can see that not too far down that road, it's going to get very complicated and messy. So that by focusing some on this embodiment stuff, grounding and centering, being mindful of where we're caught, creating this foundation, then beginning to bear the vulnerability and the spacious heart of an open heart will be much easier to do. These are developmental stages. Okay. And traditionally, or according to theory, that one doesn't go into these heartfelt relationship things until you're about 5 or 6 years old. That you have to go through the grounding, the centering, the impulse control kinds of things before you can really get to the point where you can be a loving human being. Okay, so we paid enough attention that the heart begins to open, and the heart then can begin to bear the suffering that we're feeling, because we realize that the heart is infinitely spacious, that the I that suffers is still there, but it's contextualized in the vastness of the reality of who we are. There's still the I fixation, but it's not right in your face. It's just this one point in the vast sky of mind. Pema Chodron says, you're the sky, you're not the weather. Don't get busy identifying with the weather. The weather, some days it's cloudy, sometimes there's hail, thunder, lightning, fog. But the sky is always there. The sky doesn't change. The sky is not affected by the weather. So can we be the space, the consciousness in which emotions, sensations, perceptions, thoughts are arising? Okay. Before I plunge on with my great enthusiasm, are there any remarks or questions?
So grateful, Dale. Yes, we are having lots of fun. This is just right. This is chicken soup for the soul, Dale. Given today's Yom Kippur,
I hope it's not chicken soup, but let's go ahead. Okay. I mean, Canfield's a really nice guy, but let's hope we're going a couple levels beyond chicken soup here.
Will you say something, and perhaps you will at a later time, but the role in which then forgiveness, perhaps, or how we sort of compassionately imagine atonement and sort of integrating that into part of the practice in perhaps a somatic way, perhaps a more reflective way?
Yeah, well, okay, so I've been talking about the path of healing, and so I'm calling the open heart compassion. Compassion is very, very close to forgiveness. It's almost exactly the same thing. And I have rarely been around somebody who's dying, who has not expressed the need for more forgiveness, or I have not said, hey, you need to do a little more forgiveness here. There's 3 kinds of forgiveness. You forgive yourself, you ask for forgiveness, or you forgive another person. And to the extent that there are these incomplete relationships with self or other, then the incredible spiritual opportunity that dying offers is going to be met only incompletely, right? So that now is the time to work with forgiveness. Now is the time to forgive yourself. Now, I mean, I know people have been meditating for 30 years, and we're talking, and they said, I had a really bad meditation yesterday. Still thinking they have to, there's a good meditation and a bad meditation. No. Okay. So atonement at one-ment, we're not quite at that stage yet. The open heart is, there's a relationship you're not at one with yet, but you're in loving relationship with. The next stage, which is Tantra, like Tibetan Buddhism, as opposed to Mahayana, Hinayana, is now it's oneness. It's realizing that it's all sacred, the way that Hafi's poem was talking about. So imagine, for instance, that you're saying a prayer or a mantra. And from the first stage of practice, where I'm talking about being present, getting grounded and centered, you're not feeling that connection yet. You're not at one with the divinity or what it is, the higher power, the divine mother, whatever you call that. So you're saying your mantra, your prayer, with the hope that God shows up. She's shown up before, or you read books where she's showing up for other people, or he's showing up for somebody you know, whatever it might happen to be. But you're kind of priming the pump. You're saying, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, or Ram, 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 or whatever prayer it is, Ahum Dalila, whatever. And you're hoping that God shows up. And when that deepens enough, then you're in this heart stage where there's this love relationship going on. You're having a love affair with God. But there's still a separation. There's God there and me here, and we're having this love affair. And you're saying the mantra as an expression of this love affair. But then that deepens to the tantric stage of at one-ment, where you are one with the object of the mantra. That the God that you're praying to and the sound of the mantra and you are all one. So like you're saying, Ram, it's not a tool to get somewhere. That Ram, the sound, is the full expression of the deity. Each time the sound comes out, it's that. Okay, so that's a little theoretical maybe. And until we, well, maybe theoretical isn't the right word, but until we're really pretty much resting in a wide open heart, that tantric stage of saying Ram and knowing it is Ram is only an idea. And then finally, there's the stage of non-duality where we die into wholeness. Ramana Maharshi talks about that, Adyashanti, Eckhart Tolle, Ram Dass, a lot of people talk about that. And that's the place where it's not even me and God being one, but I even disappear. There's just pure consciousness. And that's of extreme importance because that is what we die into. So to the extent we have that experience again and again as we're living, that we trust this becoming nobody, if you will, that initially there's the observer observing the observed, or the seer seeing the seen, that we're letting go of the seer and the seen. It's just seeing is going on. It's just all that's happening is consciousness meeting experience. And that's all that's happening anyway. All this other stuff we talk about is just a bunch of ideas to get us to the point where we can really bear that truth that there's nothing going on other than consciousness meeting experience. And if you want to put that in the devotional context where it's you and God, or a more Buddhist context where it's just pure consciousness, it's all really the same discussion. But that to the extent that we can at times, so like right now, just as like a really quick little exercise. So I'd like you to just listen to the sound of my voice. Don't even care about what I'm saying. Does it make sense or not? But all that's going on is listening, 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 listening. What continues when I stop? Is there some awakeness or aliveness or beingness that is more obvious in the gap, but is always there? Or like if you're watching your breath, in breath, out breath, in breath, out breath. At the end of the out breath, at the end of the in breath, what's still there? Or between thoughts? There's the sense of beingness, of awakeness, of consciousness itself. And that these people who describe enlightenment, some of them talk about God and you become one with God, but some of them say it's just resting in that sense of beingness. That the world is just like this movie that's happening, or a dream, that I'm just consciousness, I'm not affected, just in the way that it's like the sky's not being affected by the weather, or the movie screen's not being affected by the images that are being projected on it. What is it that does not change from moment to moment? Sound of my voice changes, what's going on in your body changes. You can pay attention to your body's an object. You can pay attention to your mind's an object. What's the subject? Can we remember the subject and hang out in the subject? The subject, in my humble opinion, does not die. Okay, so to the extent we're resting in that which doesn't die, our relationship with death gets to be a pretty much different relationship than it was when we were thinking we were going to die. Okay, so
I have a question. Will you say more words about the subject and the object and resting in that same space? Because I
Yeah.
am intrigued and I don't really understand. Thank you.
okay. So an ancient sage said, what you are looking for is who is looking. And life is so fascinating. I just love life. One time I went to see a Vedic astrologer. He had a great reputation. And he looked at my chart and he started laughing. He said, RamDev, it must be so hard to be you. You love God so much and you love the world so much. You're caught between those all the time, right? So it is a predicament, but that's the predicament we're all in to one extent or the other, that we identify with the objects of experience. And the objects can be even your own body, your own thoughts, okay? So that there's a certain level of Buddhist meditation that's called Dzogchen. And one of the slogans there is, no meditation, no distraction. And the idea is that there's really nobody meditating, because if you look carefully, you can't find a you. There's no I in the obvious sense. In fact, when they hook people up to functional MRI machines and ask them to think about I, all these different points in the brain light up. And then they ask them to think about not I, and all these other points interspersed with the first points light up. So it's not like there's a place in you that's I. It's a bunch of concepts. And what we're doing with these stages of getting motivated and getting embodied and grounded and centered and mindful and opening the heart through compassion and forgiveness and gratitude and devotion and loving kindness is getting to the point where we can begin to bear ego death. As long as you're, I mean, St. Paul talks about die before you die, right? And what we're talking about here is exactly that as long as you're, who is that voice who asked the question? Is that?
Michaela.
Okay, so Michaela asked the question. She's Michaela asking the question. I'm Dale answering the question. And a lot of the times we're hanging out in our duality, so that my direct experience is that we're twofold beings, and that it's important to remember that the dying patient or the grieving patient is a twofold being, that there's a human being. We don't want to in any way diminish or ignore the human story, possible tragedy that's going on there, and say, it's all God, it's all fine, it's all perfect. Like Hafiz is saying, everything is sacred. Well, it is all sacred. And people are suffering like crazy all the time. I mean, it's like Suzuki Roshi, who's so quotable, said, you're all perfect, but there's still some room for improvement. So it's like that can we embody our humanity? Can we honor our humanity and the humanity of the people around us? And at the same time, have some deep wisdom that it's all contextualized in the sky-like nature of reality, that consciousness itself is boundless. And as a recovering scientist, I could, if I had more time, we could talk about the double slit experiment. We could talk about things that quantum mechanics is mathematically proving that there is no that quantum mechanics has proven mathematically that there is no separable objective reality out there, that's backwards, that actually we are creating through consciousness form. And like, for instance, there are various experiments where light can be either form or energy, waves or particles. And if nobody's viewing the light, it's energy. it takes somebody to view it to create form. They have it turned into particles. And there's all kinds of other experiments, so that we're living in this collective deep delusion of the way things are, that they aren't that way. And if you have taken strong psychedelics, and given that this is San Francisco, I would guess that a pretty good percentage of people here have had experiences through psychedelics, through deep meditation, maybe being in nature, but thirdly, psychedelics, where we had the direct perception that it's all energy, everything's all vibrating, and that was not a hallucination because you were taking a drug, that it was a deep reality that you were missing because you hadn't taken the drug, that you were caught in this delusion all the time, right? So I fully admit that what I'm saying now can sound a little bit abstract or theoretical, but it's a natural outgrowth of being able to rest in a deeply open, connected heart, where we're not busy protecting or aggrandizing the I constellation. And then we begin to see the oneness of things. We begin to see the sacredness of people dying of hunger. And I mean, it's like either God is everything or she doesn't exist, right? I mean, it's not like God's the good stuff and the starving people are anti-God or whatever. No, it's like the beloved can only be everything, at least as far as I can. That's the only way I can think of the whole thing. So how can we have this universe where people are starving to babies, totally innocent babies are starving to death or being horribly abused? Things like that are happening right now at this moment all over the world. And it takes an expanded enough mind to be with the tragic humanity of that and the perfection of that at the same time. And until we can do both of those things, dying is going to be a bit of a struggle. Any other remarks? We've got about 10 more minutes here. And maybe that didn't answer your question. If it didn't, feel free to let me know where it's sitting right now.
Dale, there's a question that's come up, and I'm going to give a metaphor, and you tell us if you would abide in this comparison, and if so, how you would tweak it. So Steve Jobs early on in the 90s talked about, the personal PC computer as the wrong way to think about it, and rather that the network is the computer. And so this is now the departure between Microsoft Windows, perhaps in the old days, and Unix and Linux and open source code that was available to all. But the idea was that the network, maybe in this case, consciousness, would be the primary connective tissue, and not us all in our own PCs. Is that fair? And if so, how would you tinker with it to dial it into consciousness as such in this way?
Okay, well, two points. The first is just kind of a humorous aside, but Steve Jobs came up with the idea of the personal computer on LSD at my guru's ashram in India. Right. And as he was dying, he had Maharaj's picture by his bedside. But Thich Nhat Hanh, wonderful Buddhist saint, said that in this day and age, the Sangha, the network of seekers has become the Buddha. We don't look for the Buddha on the altar or in one particular person, but that the Buddha, because of the needs of this particular time, the Buddha has become the community of all of us, the network of people engaged in spiritual pursuit, which I think is really pretty much exactly what Steve was saying in terms of the network of computers.
And so then the real question then is, given the state of technology now, in the ways in which we're more networked than ever, perhaps, do you think that because you were talking about taking your expertise in math and really seeing patterns, is it possible that through the use of precisely the technology that's linking us together, that in a certain sense we're going back to or our minds are sort of adapting to this notion of network and the essential sort of, in your words, consciousness that informs what we would then otherwise perceive us as individuals, that our minds are actually being led perhaps back to seeing and trusting the network in a way that perhaps is less atomized than it would have been 20, 30,
Yeah,
thousands of years ago.
I wish I were more optimistic about what's happening. I'm not particularly. Mayor Baba said, love is contagious. Those who haven't got it catch it from those who do. So certainly, I mean, even if it's over Zoom, that we're kind of, I mean, I can even tell a story where I was with Maharaji. It's a whole long story, but just to summarize it, what he was doing was really boring. And I had just gotten there and I thought, what am I doing here with this guy? He's just talking about the price of milk in America. I want God. I mean, why is he talking about that? And maybe Ramdas made a mistake. Maybe he's not who Ramdas thinks he is. Maybe he's just some old guy. And at that point, there was this explosion in my mind that I knew came from him, hard to describe how. But he said, we can talk about complicated things and atomizing networks and whatever, but in every moment, there's an ocean of love that's available. And if we're talking about bullshit, it's easier to rest in the ocean of love than if we're talking about really interesting things. The Chinese have a curse, maybe be born in an interesting time, because the mind gets all fascinated with all the interesting bullshit that's going on, rather than resting in the simplicity of the way things actually are. So, I don't know. I mean, I've got a 20-year-old son who's studying philosophy. Maybe he'll follow the footsteps of Nate and Laura, was it? I guess. And I keep telling him Declan, which is actually the real name of Elvis Costello was Declan. That was his name. That I'd say, Declan, things are going to get really weird really pretty soon here. You should get an education that prepares you to be flexible and, you know, move with the punches, if you will. So there are some remarkable young people that I have a great deal of confidence in. And when I look at my son and think of what I was like at 20 and what he's like at 20, it's like two different species practically, how mature he is and how compassionate he is. But at the same time, the forces that are coming to us in the world are very different than they were in the 1950s and 60s, early 60s. So I don't know the answer to your question, Nate. I mean, which direction we're moving. All I know is that I'm trying to find practical ways for me to be more alive and to share them with as many people as I can. Suzuki Roshi said something like, I'm not trying to teach my students enlightenment. I'm trying to teach them how to hear the birds sing. And to me, it's a real simple thing. How simple can we be? How humble can we be? And compassion doesn't mean we're always being nice and kind. If you're a parent, you know that you've got to say no firmly and lovingly at times. And compassion is saying no. Compassion is pushing back. But it's coming from that open-hearted place. So Ramdas, toward the end of his life, let go of all these complicated teachings. And he just was saying, I am loving awareness. I am loving awareness. I'm not Ramdas. I'm not who I thought I was. It's not just awareness, it's loving awareness. And can we be that simple? His last movie or book or whatever it was I think called Becoming Nobody. But it took him surviving a stroke for 20 years and being 80 some years old to get to the point of becoming nobody. He was very stubbornly ensconced in being Ramdas for a very long time. Right? And he was with some of the best teachers on the whole damn planet. You know, so maybe you're not as stubborn as he is, hopefully. Anybody else have any comments that I haven't driven away yet? Okay, Rick.
Yeah, Dale, couple of comments and then a question.
Yeah.
One of the things that calmed me in my death anxiety was similar to what you're talking about. And I got it from sort of the American Indian tradition, which is the cosmos in effect is a river. We come out of the river, walk around a while, and then return to the river. That would be the concept of wholeness to me.
Mhm.
At the same time, when I was an Uber driver, I was fortunate enough being in Berkeley, driving literally Nobel winning physicists to the airport and back. And we would get into, I'm a chaplain, and so we would get into conversations about the universe and theology. And one of the things that kept coming up was we only know 4% of the universe from a physical, tactile standpoint,
Right.
that so much is unknown. Those are my comments. The question is, I have a project called Ars Moriendi Project, with the Art of Dying Well, which really comes out of a lay practice that was taught during the Black Plague,
Right.
of helping people find wholeness in death. How, or do you have some tools in how to communicate to lay people, finding a way to help others come in contact with their own death?
The answer is yes. Next question.
Thank you.
Uh,
That clarifies a lot.
Okay. So, I mean, there are a number of practices on the website. There's something called the Ah breath. There's something called Poa. To me, the best thing you can do is the way I started out this whole talk. If you can be resting in the one mind, knowing in your bones the thing about in and out of the river, and be with another human being, then that human being will realize, maybe not even consciously, but somewhere inside will realize, here's somebody who knows I'm dying, and they're not lost in that. Maybe I don't have to be lost in that either, which is way beyond any clever advice or practices that you can do. So there's different levels of intervention or support. And the deepest one is what I call spiritual healing, which is you seeing the God in people. Maharaji said, it is a mistake to try to teach by individual karmic differences. You teach the place of wholeness. You keep going to the place of wholeness. The guru keeps seeing you as whole until you finally believe it. You say, this guy thinks he sees how horny and neurotic and anxious I am, and he still thinks I'm complete love. Maybe he's right, right? So, and there are things that can be done. And as I said, that they are described on the website in some detail. I mean, we really only have 28 seconds now, so probably we're not going to get into that.
Dale, do you want to steer us home here in any way that you'd like?
Yeah, let's just take a moment and breathe directly into your chest. Like, just imagine you had nostrils in the center of your chest, and you were breathing into your heart. And as you breathe out into infinite spaciousness in all directions, front, back, right, left, up, down. Breathing into your heart, love, forgiveness, compassion, breathing out spaciousness. And as you're doing this, remember what brought you to this work. Remember why we're together. Remember what is the most important thing. And dedicate any wisdom that we may have accumulated during this hour together, with the wish that all beings might suffer less, might find lasting peace, freedom from the causes of suffering, wherever they may be. And then just coming back, feeling the sensations in your body without judging them as good or bad, whatever is predominating. You're sitting up on a chair, your body's moving a little bit because you're breathing. Emotions, motion, moving energy flowing through your body. Just being with that without making a story about it, without having to say it's my elbow, my pain. It's just sensation. It's just experience, directly, nakedly meeting experience. And from this place, feeling our connectedness in this room, the love that we share. Thank you all very much for your kind attention. I got a little bit carried away today, but that's fun too.
Love you so much, Dale. So grateful for you.
Hey, could I get a recording of this?